r/AskReddit by Reddify. What piece of history is too crazy to believe, yet is still true? Pope/Saint Leo met alone with the Hunnic armies just about to sack Rome. Nobody knows what he said to Attila, but it made him take his massive army and turn it around, leaving the Roman Empire for the time being, saving Rome and its inhabitants from God knows what. The personal accounts of the First World War. Out in no man's land, the sun swelled up the dead with gas and often turned them blue, almost navy blue. Then, when the gas escaped, the bodies dried up like mummies and were frozen in their death positions, sitting bodies, kneeling bodies, bodies in almost every position, though most lay on their bellies or on their backs. The crows pecked out the eyes and rats lived on bodies that lay in abandoned dugouts. These rats were very large and quite fearless, their familiarity with the dead having made them contemptuous of the living. One night one fell on my face in a dugout and bit me. Where we fought several times over the same ground, bodies became incorporated in the material of the trenches themselves. They were putrid, with the consistency of camembert cheese. I once fell and put my hand right through the belly of a man. It was days before I got the smell out of my nails. The entirety of H.H. Holmes. Man literally made a murder hotel castle in Chicago in the late 1800s and got away with it for years. Edit. Also, if anyone is interested, I learned most info about him and other serial killers, ghosts, aliens, etc. from a podcast that I love named Last Podcast on the Left. They have a 3-part episode on Holmes. It is like 3 hours long in total. Informative and funny. Believe it or not, the podcast may not be everyone's taste, but it's highly worth checking out. The Dancing Plague. It's so ridiculously hilarious. People danced for days, I think it lasted over a month, and eventually died of heart attacks, exhaustion, or strokes. They just couldn't stop. One of the greatest natural disasters in human history was the flu between 1918 and 1920. 500 million contacted it, and 100 million, 5% of the world population, died. We went to the ducking moon and came back. Then we went back up with a car and did donuts on the ducking moon. In 896, Pope Stephen VI put a previous and dead pope on trial. Pope Firmicus was found guilty, depopified, and thrown in the river. Edit. Spelling. In 1866, Liechtenstein sent 80 men off to war. 81 men came back. They hadn't lost a man and made a new Italian friend along the way. It's their last official military engagement. Edit. 1866. Not 1886, as has been kindly pointed out to me. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and the world did almost nothing about it. The Great Emu War gets me every time. When nuclear power was conceived and reactors were built, they did all of the math without calculators and computers. Used slide rules. How many of us crutch on that handy phone calculator every day? I know I do. That 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki instantly killed 70 to 80,000 people in the blink of an eye. Who was that Chinese leader who didn't have a big enough army to repel invaders, so he just left the gates wide open? The invaders were so convinced that he was confident because he had a huge army and they left. The technology difference in the short time between World War I and II. In 66 years mankind went from the Wright brothers' first powered flight to landing on the moon. Edit. Originally I had a typo calling them the Wright brothers. Shortly after the American Civil War, a group of Irish Americans calling themselves the Fenian Brotherhood banded together, sold war bonds, and attempted to invade and hold Canada hostage in an attempt to get Britain to release Ireland. There were 5 major raids. Of those raids, the Fenians actually won 2 battles and briefly held Canadian territory. After the first raid, the United States Navy cut off their supply lines and the Fenians were forced to retreat back to the US. The second raid was a comedy of errors perpetrated by the Canadian militia and British Army. Essentially, the Queen's Own Rifles, who were a ragtag militia at the time, met the Fenian Brotherhood's army and exchanged fire for a brief period. Not long after, the British Army arrives. The Queen's own rifles retire from the field to give room for the British regulars. Mistaking this as a general retreat, the British Army also retires the field. The rest of the raids essentially follow a pattern of the Fenians exchanging useless fire with the Canadians/British, then going home. The last raid is perhaps the funniest. While other invasions had hundreds to even over 1,000 men, the last had approximately 30. Their plan was to go into central Canada via the Dakota Territory. They attack a Hudson trading post and, shortly after, are arrested by the US authorities. This attack never actually made it to Canada, as surveyors found that the trading post was actually in what is now Minnesota. Most of the Fenian soldiers suffered no consequences for essentially spending several years invading Canada. Solely basing this on Irish pride in Netflix, with some short reading after. 157 Irish peacekeepers based in the Congo held off 3,000 attackers, killing over 300 of them, sustaining no losses themselves and a few injuries. Received no support from the UN and eventually surrendered when they used every bullet twice, quite literally. They made a shrapnel bomb with the empty shells. It was the first time an official army from Ireland faced combat. The Irish government swept it under the rug, pretended it didn't happen due to the surrender, which they considered a disgrace. OHH. I used to post on Facebook for a music school and came across this gem. Around the time of the great classical writers, a common yet interesting thing was that composers would challenge each other to 1v1s. Music duels. Mostly improvisation duels. Beethoven one day was challenged by a composer named Stiebelt. The cocky young composer challenged him and went first. Stiebelt threw his own composition on the ground and played perfectly, met with rousing applause. Beethoven, however, stood up, took the piece that Stiebelt threw to the ground, and showed it to the audience. Nobles loved watching this hit. He took it and turned it upside down. He sat down and played it perfectly. He then took the theme of the composition and improvised on it for over an hour. Stiebelt left halfway through, but promised to never return to Vienna as long as Beethoven lived there. Beethoven lived in Vienna until he died. American government did mind control experiments. The only reason the Union was warned about the Battle of Antietam was that some Donbass officer dropped his orders while they were wrapped in cigars. Australia introduced cane toads to eliminate cane beetles, but turns out they had no interest in eating the cane beetles, so they had two problems on their hands. How difficult it was for the conspirators to kill Rasputin. Johnny Cash was the first person in the Western world to hear of the death of Joseph Stalin. While stationed at Landsberg in West Germany, it was his job to intercept Soviet Morse code communications. On March 5, 1953, Johnny intercepted the communication that told of the death of one of history's most important men. Johnny Cash was obliged to keep the secret for many years, but it was revealed in his autobiography, Cash by Johnny Cash. Hiroo Onoda, a soldier in the Japanese army during WW2 who fought in the war for 30 years after it ended. He was told to never surrender himself or commit suicide under any circumstances. When he was fighting in the jungles, he and his squad were told that the war was over. He thought that this was the Allies trying to get him to surrender. He continued to raid villages, which he thought were enemy bases, for the next 30 years. Another unbelievable story is the one of Yang Kung-jang. He was a Korean man who was forced to fight in the Japanese Imperial Army in WW2. During the war, he was captured by Russia and forced to fight in the Russian Red Army. While fighting for Russia, he was captured by the German Wehrmacht and forced to fight for them as well. As far as I know, he was the only person in the Second World War to fight for 3 different armies. I find the fact that British King George V, Russian Tsar Nicholas II, and German Kaiser Wilhelm II were cousins very odd. The Second Crusade ended when the Queen of France banged her uncle. Dinosaurs ducking existed. One of the bloodiest wars of all time, often tallied as the second most, ahead of WW1, depending on the parameters, was caused by a Chinese guy claiming to be Jesus' younger brother and leading a revolution along the Yangtze River in China. Hitler, Lenin, Trotsky, Tito, Freud, and Stalin all lived in the same neighborhood in Zurich, Vienna at the same time. Edit. Thanks for the correction you/C Messiahable. The 30 Years' War. A war that devastated Europe and led to the demise of the Holy Roman Empire. Arguably the biggest and most powerful empire in Europe. Was started by some guys pushing government officials out of windows into horsemanure. The event even has its own name, the Defenestration of Prague. Probably some of the hit that various Roman emperors got up to just because they could. Caligula made a whole bunch of boats line up over the Bay of Baiae so he could use them as a bridge to defy prophecy. Nero had his mother killed and kicked his pregnant wife to death. Domitian openly wanted the people to call him a god, which was absolute heresy to Romans. And that's just a tiny fragment of what a few emperors did. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can watch together.